Lord, we come before you today with such thankful hearts for all the good times and the laughter that you give us. We thank you for friendships and just time to be together. Thank you for Doris and making such special treats for us today. And we ask that you be with us as we learn your word. In your name we pray. Amen. Well, last week we heard about twin boys. Does anybody remember their names? The twin boys? Jacob and Esau, that's right. Jacob and Esau. And they had problems from the time they were in the womb until finally Jacob and Esau got so mad at Jacob that he threatened to kill him, and their parents sent Jacob away to his uncle. All right, now it's about 20, 25 years after that event, and we're going to hear about what happened with Jacob and his children and see if he does a better job with them than his parents did with him. Okay? So if you missed last week and you didn't read last week's lesson, we'll still help you fill you in so you know what's going on. I don't want you to feel bad. Okay, we're going to need somebody who would like to read Bible verses today. Ellie? Sure, that would be great. So, let's turn this on. It works better. Okay. There. Okay.
Sometime later, Leah gave birth to a daughter and named her Dinah.
Now Jacob had been tricked into marrying Leah. She was the older sister of the gal he really, really loved, and her name was Rachel. He and Rachel also would marry later, but from the time he was married to both sisters would compete for Jacob's love and attention and the privilege of bearing his babies. Now, over time, Jacob became the father of 12 sons. But Dinah is the only daughter that's recorded in the Bible. So we don't know if she was the only girl or just, they didn't normally mention girls, so there probably were more daughters. We just don't know about them.
Then the Lord said to Jacob, "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you."
Jacob had been working for his uncle Laban, that's Leah and Rachel's father. For 20 years he'd been working for him. But he was still very apprehensive about returning to his home. So when God said, "Go back there," he thought, "Oh, I remember, Esau was not happy with me." He had fled after stealing his twin brother's birthright and blessing. Well, now he would have to face him, and he didn't know if Esau still wanted to kill him. You know, just a regular family Thanksgiving dinner, you know? So Jacob packed up his family and possessions, and he began the long journey back home. And as they neared his homeland, Jacob got more and more agitated and nervous what was going to happen. So he came up with this wonderful idea. He sent servants ahead of him, and they were just loaded down with gifts and animals. He hoped that if he sent enough gifts, it would bribe his brother into not being angry at him anymore.
Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him as they wept. And they wept.
Esau cried tears of happiness to see his brother Jacob after all these years. Jacob's tears were tears of relief that he was no longer going to be pursued by his brother. As Jacob introduced all of his wives and children, Esau assured Jacob that he had no need of all those gifts that Jacob had sent ahead of him. However, Jacob implored Esau to accept them, since he was so grateful to be forgiven. When Esau suggested that it was time to leave and they should head home together, Jacob insisted that his animals and children were so slow that Esau and his men should go ahead and they would follow him.
After Jacob came from Paddan Aram, northwest Mesopotamia, he arrived safely at the city of Shechem in Canaan and camped within sight of the city. For 100 pieces of silver he brought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, the plot of ground where he pitched his tent.
Jacob had told his brother Esau that they would follow him, but instead, Jacob is still the trickster. He went a different route and eventually decided to stop in Shechem long enough that he bought property there to stay on. So this wasn't just a weekend getaway. He was planning on being there for quite a while. Was he still deceiving Esau? Or was he just afraid? This land purchase would be recalled years later. In the book of Joshua, chapter 24:32 tells us, Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem in the tract of land that Jacob bought for 100 pieces of silver from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. This became the inheritance of Joseph's descendants. Jacob's decision to settle in this Canaanite city of Shechem, instead of going home as God had instructed him, would turn into a family tragedy.
Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, had born to Jacob, went out to visit the women of the land.
Dinah is somewhere between the age of 13 and 16 years old, by most commentators' reckoning. She feels the bright lights of the city calling her. Now, the custom of the day was that unmarried girls seldom would leave their households, and if they did, never without a chaperone. The verb in Hebrew hints at promiscuous behavior, but it's not explicit. It lets us read between the lines. Even the fact that she visited the women of the land is questionable in light of previous disparaging passages concerning Canaanite women. Because remember what Jacob's mother Rebekah said last week in Genesis 26, 46 to 28, verse 1? Then Rebekah said to Isaac, I'm disgusted with living because of these Hittite women. If Jacob takes a wife from among the women of this land, from Hittite women like these, my life will not be worth living. So Isaac called for Jacob and blessed him. Then he commanded him, do not marry a Canaanite woman.
Famous last words.
Yeah, famous last words. Dinah's grandmother, Rebekah, had made this statement to her husband, Isaac, after their eldest son, Esau, had married 2 Canaanite women, and she was afraid that Jacob would do the same. Also, at the time, Rebekah had wanted to get Jacob safely away from his brother Esau, who was so angry at him that he had threatened to kill him. Now, this was especially dangerous for Dinah to intermix so freely among the ungodly, idol-worshiping inhabitants of Shechem. Was discipline at home too lax? Evidence of Jacob's complacency is found in other things that occurred in his home. For instance, at that time, Jacob allowed the worship of idols in his home. Jacob, it appears, was not fulfilling his duty as the head of the household by protecting his family. God had already told Jacob and God's blossoming nation, which was the sons of Jacob, soon to be the nation of Israel, that they were not to intermarry or make treaties with the people of the land, the Canaanites, because they worshiped false gods. Deuteronomy 7 verse 3 says, "Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons." Perhaps in Dinah's mind, just visiting with them, how could that possibly hurt? And certainly there is no law prohibiting visits with those who don't believe in Jehovah. Unfortunately, her curiosity will bring great pain to both her and her family. Some scholars think that the Bible is prejudiced in its depiction of the Canaanite people. But the Bible states quite clearly that their lifestyle was immoral. Their great sin was the reason God would command the Israelites to drive them out of the promised land. God tells his people not to commit the abominations for which the Canaanites are so well known. He says in Leviticus 18:25, "The land has become unclean, and I punished it for its sins. So this land is throwing out those people who live there." God is not prone to exaggeration. In their own literature, Canaanites reveal that they were a people who reveled in wanton slaughter, adultery, bestiality, homosexuality, drunkenness, and idolatry. Just a regular party crowd, huh? This is why God commanded that the Israelites separate themselves from them. He did not want the Israelites to be influenced by the sinful Canaanite lifestyles. Tradition states through the historian Josephus that Dinah actually went to the annual Canaanite festival of nature worship. She wasn't just visiting with the other women, but she was watching heathen ceremonies. In Numbers 25:2, we're told Moabite women invited the Israelites to the sacrifices to their gods. The people ate and bowed down before these gods. God wants us to be content and not to be tempted by the curiosities of this world. Whether watching movies with unnecessary violence or sex, or reading magazines about cults and the dishonesty of safe sex, God wants us to be righteous beacons of his light in a dark world.
When Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, the ruler of that area, saw her, he took her and violated her. New International Version. He took her and laid with her and defiled her. King James Version. He took her and lay with her by force. American Standard Bible. He took her and raped her. New Living Translation and the Living Bible saw her and raped her. The Message.
The language in these different translations may be ambiguous as to whether Shechem raped Dinah or seduced her. Now, before it gets too confusing, Shechem is the name of the town they lived in, and it's also the name of the king's son. Okay? So call the incident what you will. At best, Dinah was a naive young girl who was preyed upon by a young man who was used to getting what he wanted when he wanted it. At worst, Dinah left home that day a carefree young virgin who had now been raped. Life would never be the same for her or her family. Hebrew law would state in Deuteronomy 22 verses 28 to 29, if a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay the girl's father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the girl, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. Whether or not Shechem had raped Dinah or merely seduced her, she was defiled. Any sex outside of marriage is not an act of love, but an act of defilement. A young man who urges a young woman to have sex with him is not showing love to her, but he's being selfish and hateful in desiring to ruin her. Shechem was the son of privilege. His father Hamor was the Canaanite king, and Shechem would most likely assume the throne once dear old dad died. Now, we could be generous and say that Shechem may have been a victim of love at first sight, but his actions were impulsive and evil. It doesn't matter how indulged he was. Shechem not only crossed the line in his behavior with Dinah, but he also went way beyond it. Not only did he sin against Dinah by raping her, he sinned against her entire family. The consequences of his deed would be severe both for his family and for Jacob's.
His heart was drawn to Dinah, daughter of Jacob, and he loved the girl and spoke tenderly to her.
Now this verse makes it appear as though this was more of a seduction than a rape. But we're only getting Shechem's side of the story here. How was Dinah feeling? Had Shechem been on her radar for a while? Had Dinah had a crush on him? Had she gotten into a situation that was really more than she could handle? Did she even really know Shechem? Had she cried out for help? Or was she so frightened at what was happening that she just went to a place inside of herself where she could block out everything that was going on? There have always been those who believe that the girl is just as much to blame, or perhaps even more, as the boy is for a rape. But make no mistake about it, rape is a violent crime against a female that leaves deep emotional scars. Today, we're fortunate to have trained professionals who can help get her through the difficult aftermath. But she will always carry the scars of what happened. Imagine what it was like back in Dinah's time, when you would be forced to marry the person who raped you, or else never have the opportunity to marry anyone else, because you were no longer a virgin. That's what Dinah would now be facing. Even Shechem's declared love and tender words for Dinah could not excuse the evil he did by raping her. Instead of controlling his sexual passion for Dinah, he allowed it to boil over into evil actions. Passion must be controlled.
And Shechem said to his father Hamor, "Get me this girl as my wife."
Then Shechem goes home, tells his father to arrange a marriage between them because he was enamored with Dinah, as if that could possibly rectify what he had done. If trying to arrange a marriage after a rape sounds a little unusual to us, it didn't seem to be a problem for Hamor and his son. While arranged marriages were the norm in the culture of the Middle East, they were not preceded by a rape. Was Shechem just trying out the goods first, or was he just so infatuated with Dinah that he wanted to make an honest woman out of her? Does he even realize what a serious crime he had committed against Dinah? For the Jews in Bible times, it was marriage first and love afterwards. Arranged marriages were customary. Sons and daughters were expected to go along with whoever their parent chose for them. Arrangements for a future marriage were made by the father and were sometimes planned while the bride and groom were quite young. Of course, this does not mean that the parents ignored their children's feelings entirely. Love was even known to bloom before marriage occurred, as we saw in Jacob's devotion to Rachel.
When Jacob heard that his daughter Dinah had been defiled, his sons were in the fields with his livestock. So he kept quiet about it until they came home.
How did Jacob find out what had happened to Dinah? Had she gone home and told her mother, Leah? Had she arrived home with her clothes in disarray? Had a nosy neighbor dropped by with the news? When someone is victimized, they often feel that they are to be blamed, so they don't tell anyone. They carry a secret that, if told, could help stop the victimizer from hurting others. In addition to feeling guilty about being attacked, the victim carries a great deal of emotional pain. Sharing the secret and finding help for the problem is the way to bring about healing. However, Jacob found out what had happened to his daughter. He is not a headstrong man, and he decides to wait until he can discuss the matter with his sons. This verse expresses Jacob's weakness as the head of the household. Jacob should have taken charge of the situation. He should have investigated it and seen what had happened. He should have negotiated with Hamor, who was Shechem's father and the ruler of the area, and tried to reach a settlement based on what truly had happened. If Shechem was found to have raped Dinah, Jacob could have urged Hamor to punish him severely. And if Hamor was found to be unwilling to punish his son, then Jacob's family would have had just cause to wage a war against the city. As it was, Jacob, the godly man, left the situation up to his ungodly sons.
Then Shechem's father Hamor went out to talk with Jacob.
Now it was customary in ancient Israel for parents to arrange their children's marriages and draw up the marriage contract. Matrimony was more of a business arrangement, and the best offer won. So after Shechem tells Dad that he has his girl all picked out, Hamor doesn't waste a moment coming to broker a deal with Jacob for the marriage of their two children. He's over at Jacob's tent before Jacob's sons even arrive home for dinner. Jacob must have been stunned at jovial Hamor wanting to arrange a marriage after what his son had done to Dinah. No apology from Hamor or his son is offered for what had been done to Dinah. How do they ignore the fact that a girl had been raped? Does Hamor even know what his son did?
Now Jacob's sons had come in from the field as soon as they heard what had happened. They were filled with grief and fury because Shechem had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, a thing that should not be done.
Even in an age without cell phones, it doesn't take long for the shocking news about Dinah to reach her brothers who are out in the field working. They, we're told, are filled with grief and fury. It doesn't matter that Shechem is the crown prince. That did not give him the right to rape Dinah. The situation is further complicated because Dinah's rapist is not Hebrew, but he's a Canaanite, and they had different laws and customs. This unthinkable, immoral act puts the whole family in a tailspin. The book of Deuteronomy deals with the instructions and laws that God gave to Moses and the Hebrews. It was of paramount importance for a girl to keep herself pure and virginal until her wedding night, or the result would be death by stoning. If a girl who was raped was found innocent in the matter, she would never be able to marry another man because she was no longer pure. Since a woman in Bible times, her sole function was to marry and bear children, a rape victim's life, for all intents and purposes, was now over. Deuteronomy 22:21 tells us, "She shall be brought to the door of her father's house, and there the men of the town shall stone her to death. She has done a disgraceful thing in Israel by being promiscuous while still in her father's house. You must purge the evil from among you."
And Hamor said to them, "My son Shechem has his heart set on your daughter. Please give her to him as his wife."
With the arrival of Jacob's sons, Hamor now finds himself negotiating with all of them and Jacob too. It was customary when a marriage was arranged to discuss the price a groom would pay the bride's father for the girl. This is what Hamor was trying to arrange. Hamor must have been ignorant concerning what his son had done, or must have believed the action was consensual. For if he had thought that Shechem had raped Dinah, he would never have been so bold as to negotiate a marriage between the two of them. Meanwhile, Jacob and his sons must have wondered why no apology, at the very least, was being offered.
"Intermarry with us. Give us your daughters and take our daughters for yourselves. You can settle among us. The land is open to you. Live in it, trade in it, and acquire property in it."
Hamor senses Jacob's coolness, and he proceeds to sweeten the marriage proposal by consenting to let Jacob and his sons intermarry with the girls and in the area and settle down there. In fact, rather than sensing any enmity between the city of Shechem and Jacob's family because of this episode, Hamor wants to use this marriage to start an ongoing alliance between his community and Jacob's family. He further offers to let Jacob's family trade in the town and to acquire property, rights that were usually reserved for native-born citizens. Hamor is looking at the big picture here. Not just this little love match between his son and a Hebrew girl. Jacob is a man of wealth who has 12 sons, and most of them are married and have children. His brother Esau, also with a large clan, lives close by. These two brothers could join together and wage war on Shechem. Or Jacob could become an upstanding citizen of Shechem. By intermarrying his children with those of the town, his loyalty would soon be to Hamor. Wouldn't it be better to make an ally out of Jacob's family rather than an enemy? Hamor's a politician. Certainly, after being raped, Dinah cannot wish to marry Shechem, even if her father agrees to it. But what other option does she really have? She knows that no other Hebrew man will have her now. What is life going to hold for her? Those city lights aren't looking so bright anymore. Hamar's offer demonstrates why God wanted Jacob to return to his relatives and live near them and not settle on the border of a heathen city. God's plan was to establish the nation of Israel through the 12 sons of Jacob. To intermarry with Canaanites would have thwarted his plan. The sons of Israel, rather than becoming a nation, would have just become another clan in the city of Shechem.
Then Shechem said to Dinah's father and brothers, "Let me find favor in your eyes, and I will give you whatever you ask. Make the price for the bride and the gift that I am to bring as great as you like, and I'll pay whatever you ask. Only give me the girl as my wife."
Sensing Jacob's family's hostility and knowing the reason for it, Shechem takes over the negotiations from his father, something that would never have happened in a Hebrew household. And he grandly offers to pay whatever the asking price is. He is blithely unaware what Hebrew law states. If a man seduces a virgin that is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must still pay the bride price for virgins. Exodus 22, verse 16. A man did not let his daughter go for nothing. In normal circumstances, the prospective groom needed to haggle with his future father-in-law over a bride price. Dad was losing some of his household help, so the groom had to make an exchange. It was also customary for the prospective groom or his representative to give gifts to the bride-to-be, just as Eliezer had brought gold bracelets and a nose ring for Jacob's mother, Rebekah. But these were not normal circumstances, and it seemed everyone knew it except for Hamor. Jacob knows that this marriage, which would be an intermarriage between a Canaanite man and his daughter, and against God's command, is just never going to take place. God had already told Jacob and his people that they are not to intermarry or make treaties with the people of Canaan.
Because her sister Dinah had been defiled, Jacob's son replied deceitfully as they spoke to Shechem and his father Hamor.
Now Hamor was very reasonable and honorable in his proposal to the sons of Jacob. If Jacob's sons had apprised him of the reason for their rage and fury over what Shechem had done, Hamor may very well have worked out a settlement that was reasonable to both families. The sons of Jacob, however, chose another route. While Jacob steps back and lets his adult sons deal with this horrid situation. Because the family had not had an opportunity to discuss this matter in private, Jacob had absolutely no idea how much hatred and hostility his sons were feeling toward Shechem and Hamor. Years earlier, Jacob had followed his mother's plan to steal his brother Esau's birthright. Now, once again, he stands aside and lets someone else, his sons, do the dirty work for him.
They said to them, "We can't do such a thing. We can't give our sister to a man who is not circumcised. That would be a disgrace to us. We will give our consent to you on one condition only, that you become like us by circumcising all your males." Ouch.
Ouch is right. Jacob's sons are as devious as their father. They lay it out. Their one requirement is that all of Shechem's male relatives and all the men of the area be circumcised, neatly explaining that it was a necessary Hebrew custom. Exodus 12:48 says, "An alien living among you who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover must have all the males in his household circumcised. Then he may take part like one born in the land. No uncircumcised male may eat of it." The rite of circumcision serves as a sign of the people's covenant pledge to walk before God and be blameless. The procedure was performed on the male reproductive organ in order to remind the recipient that this oath of allegiance was binding on both himself and all of his offspring. It's also probable that the cutting ritual within the covenant context pointed to the curse of being cut off from God that would be brought upon all covenant violators. Genesis 17:14 says, "God said to Abraham, 'Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant.'" Following the establishment of the Christian faith, all national markers such as physical circumcision lost their value, and God's people became distinguished solely by faith working itself out in love, the true sign of the identification with the Messiah through the transforming work of the Spirit.
"Then we will give you our daughters and take your daughters for ourselves. We'll settle among you and become one people with you. But if you will not agree to be circumcised, we will take our sister and go."
The brothers slyly offered to go along with Hamar's proposal if all the men in this entire city are circumcised. Their plan was disgraceful. It was horribly evil and sinful. They show their contempt for the covenant that God gave to Abraham. Rather than using this covenant of circumcision to strengthen the Shechemites spiritually, they use it to weaken them physically. They do not treat the rite of circumcision as the sacred rite of the covenant. Rather, they treat it as merely a physical rite that must be performed in order to enter into an alliance with them. They don't urge the Shechemites to the true circumcision of the heart, to the putting away of the sins of the flesh and turning to the true worship of the living God. Rather, they use circumcision as a ploy to deceive the Shechemites into weakening themselves. Jacob's sons further agree to settle in the area, settle on land that was already promised to them through Abraham by God. And they promised to intermarry with the Canaanites, something that was strictly forbidden by God. Of course, they have no intention of honoring this agreement that they're making. This is a prime example of two wrongs don't make a right. They felt that since Shechem had raped their sister, that gave them the right to deceive him. Like father, like sons. In the meantime, what is Dinah's reaction to all of this? If Shechem and Hamor do not agree to this proposal, Dinah has lost all hope of ever being a wife and mother. Why are her brothers making the terms of the marriage contract so difficult? Don't they want her to be married? Is anybody really considering her feelings in this matter?
Their proposal seemed good to Hamor and his son Shechem, the young man who was the most honored of all his father's family. Lost no time in doing what they said because he was delighted with Jacob's daughter.
Shechem, the most honored, most likely he was the firstborn son, had managed to fully dishonor Dinah, and now thought he was getting her for the bargain basement price of a few snip, snip, snips. Of course, it would be of him, his relatives, and the townspeople. Shechem never gave a second thought, however, to the fact that all the men in town would be paying his bride price. How delighted could Shechem be with Dinah if he had no regrets after raping her? It appears to be more of an infatuation on his part, and this does not bode well for Dinah's future happiness.
So Hamor and his son Shechem went to the gate of the city to speak to their fellow townsmen.
Once again, we find business being conducted at the town gate, which was the town hall of the ancient world. The main gate in the outer wall of a town or city was not just the place through which people would exit and enter, but also the primary meeting place. Inhabitants would continuously see one another coming and going, and would meet there after a day out in the fields. Traveling merchants encountered the townspeople at the gate, which became the place for the city market. Legal issues were discussed there as well. Treaties witnessed by the city elders at the gate were as legally binding as written contracts are today. There are countless references in the Bible to the gate as the social, commercial, and judicial hub of the city. Since Hamor was the ruler and Shechem the crown prince, it's doubtful that the townsmen had much say in the matter of being circumcised. The rulers were just placating the crowds by making it appear as a mutual decision.
These men are friendly towards us, they said. Let them live in our land and trade in it. The land has plenty of room for them. We can marry their daughters and they can marry sons. But the men will consent to live with us as one people only on the condition that our males be circumcised, as they are themselves. Won't their livestock, their property, and all their other animals become ours? So let us give our consent to them, and they will settle among us.
Hamor and Shechem start explaining this as a win-win deal for everyone. Aren't they sounding a lot like used car salesmen? However, evidently the detail about being circumcised was not going over as well as they had hoped, because after they alter the proposal by saying that all of the Hebrews' possessions will become the property of the town. So won't that be a great deal? But for who? Yep, they definitely sound like used car salesmen.
All the men who went out of the city gate agreed with Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male in the city was circumcised.
Most, if not all, of the town's men passed through the city gates each day. So this was the logical place to get a consensus. Everything was working out just as Shechem and Hamor had planned. All benefits and no consequences for them. You like the picture?
3 days later, while all of them were still in pain, two of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and attacked the unsuspecting city, killing every male.
Hamor and Shechem don't waste any time getting everyone to fulfill their agreement. They don't want anyone changing their mind. So after all the circumcisions are performed, the men are physically weakened and unable to protect themselves. Can you imagine a whole town of newly circumcised men and no ice bags? That's when Dinah's brothers Simeon and Levi, sons of Leah, attack the town, slaughtering all the townsmen. When Shechem raped Dinah, the consequences were far greater than he could have ever imagined. He saw something he wanted and he took it. Nothing unusual about that for the favored son of the ruler. Dinah's brothers were outraged at his crime, and they took revenge into their own hands. Pain, deceit, and murder followed. Sexual sin is devastating because its consequences are so far-reaching. Given the Shechemites' willingness to do business with the sons of Jacob and their openness to these religious rites, the whole city had consented to be circumcised. Jacob's sons could surely have used their influence to turn the inhabitants of Shechem into worshipers of the one true God. But instead, they use their influence to weaken them so they can then murder them. A true act of cowardice by the brothers. Simeon and Levi would later regret their rash decision to kill these men. When their father Jacob died, they would be left out of his will because of what they had done, and their descendants would be scattered. Genesis 49, verses 5 to 7 tells us, Simeon and Levi are two of a kind, ready to fight at the drop of a hat. I don't want anything to do with their vendettas, want no part in their bitter feuds. They'll kill men in fits of temper, slash oxen on a whim. A curse on their uncontrolled anger, on their indiscriminate wrath. I'll throw them out with the trash. I'll shred and scatter them like confetti throughout Israel.
They put Hamor and his son Shechem to the sword and took Dinah from Shechem's house and left.
Hamor and Shechem must have heard the screams from the people in the town as the men were being killed. But there wasn't anywhere for them to flee, even if they had been physically well enough. Simeon and Levi saved the royal household for last and killed all the men in Shechem's family before returning home with their sister Dinah. From this verse, we learn that Dinah had already been given in marriage to Shechem immediately following the agreement between the two families. What young Dinah had gone through in just a few short days. She had been raped, married to her attacker, saw her husband murdered by her brother, was widowed, and then witnessed the slaughter of men and boys in Shechem as she was led through the city. As Dinah witnessed the horror around her, did she say to herself, "What have I done?" She had just wanted a little personal freedom to be with her friends. So what if they didn't have the same religious beliefs as her? Should they be ignored for a little thing like that? They were fun to be around, weren't they? Everywhere Dinah looked were the dead bodies of the men of Shechem. But wait, there were bodies of boys too. She had watched as her brothers slaughtered her husband and father-in-law right before her eyes. One small request on her part to see her friends had somehow led to all of this. Was this her fault? Or had events simply gathered speed like a pebble racing downhill? Dinah's curiosity and restlessness brought great grief to herself and her family. Even so, her brothers must also be held accountable for their deception and brutality. The Word of God, however, doesn't blame. It merely shares the story and expects us to learn from it. We won't hear of Dinah again, except when she is listed in biblical genealogies. How sad the rest of her life must have been.
The sons of Jacob came upon the dead bodies and looted the city where their sister had been defiled. They seized their flocks and herds and donkeys and everything else of theirs in the city and out in the fields. They carried off all of their wealth and all the women and children, taking as plunder everything in the houses.
Shechem had raped Dinah, and now her brothers were raping the town of Shechem. What had happened to Dinah was wrong, but the punishment by Simeon and Levi and their brothers clearly did not fit the crime. Everything of value in Shechem is taken, including the women and children who would be used or sold as slaves. The brothers have gone far beyond avenging the wrong that was done to their sisters. Romans 12:19 says, "Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge. I will repay,' says the Lord." Why did Simeon and Levi take such harsh action against the city of Shechem? Jacob's family saw themselves as set apart from others, and God wanted them to remain separate from their pagan neighbors. But the brothers wrongly thought that being set apart also meant being better. This arrogant attitude led to the terrible slaughter of innocent people.
Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me by making me a stench to the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the people living in this land. We are few in number, and if they join forces against me and attack me, I and my household will be destroyed." But they replied, "Should he have treated our sister like a prostitute?"
Jacob now blames Simeon and Levi for all the trouble, even though he stood by and watched them broker the deal that would allow them to rout Shechem. Jacob takes no personal responsibility for what has happened, and his sons follow suit. They blame the king's son. It's always someone else's fault or action that's to blame. If we can lay the blame at someone else's doorstep, we don't have to examine our own actions and motives. But until we do so, how can we truly ask for God's forgiveness? And He will forgive us. Jacob, Dinah, and her brothers were forgiven and grew into the family that settled all of the promised land. Yeah, it kind of was a feel-good story. No, it's funny. Usually I try to put a cartoon up at the end of each lesson, but today's story, there was no cartoon that could go with that. It's such a sad, sad story, I think. I mean, it's like everybody made the wrong decision in what they should do. And no one wanted to accept any responsibility for it. But boy, they're good at blaming others, aren't they?
Yeah. Do you really think that Hamor didn't know?
I think it's very likely that he had no idea his son had raped Dinah. I mean, if he knew that there had been, they had spent time together, he probably assumed it was consensual.
He probably wasn't on Facebook.
But, I mean, yeah, no. He had been banned from Facebook. There were some ugly incidents. We won't go into it.
And TikTok all that money.
Yeah. You know, he was the king. he didn't, you know, he was dealing with matters of state and things like that. He really wasn't that aware of what his son was doing or not. I mean, honestly, how many parents know what their teenage children, boys or girls, are doing? When I was a teenager, I made sure my parents didn't know what I was doing. I spent more time making sure they didn't know than doing anything.
It's interesting that they were ransacking, pillaging the town, and the parallels today. Something goes wrong in a city, and so instead of taking care of it through justice or whatever, they riot. Yeah, they riot. They steal from the stores. It's.
And that's all the same thing.
Exactly.
Everybody else gets blamed.
Yeah.
And,
And the innocent are punished.
yes,
shopkeepers
the innocent
and,
get punished.
Exactly, not the ones that were at fault so much.
It's just a peaceful riot.
I'm sorry?
It's just a peaceful riot.
Well, riots and peaceful, that's an oxymoron. And this is for reading things. Donna.
And as you showed, the first domino to fall seemed so inconsequential, and led to the death of all of the men in the city.
Yeah, when you think this all started out as she wanted to spend the day with some of her friends. Now, I have a question for you. Do you take from this lesson that as a parent, you should only allow your children to associate with fellow Lutherans or fellow Christians? I will even broaden it. I mean, there was the generation before me, many times you were not allowed to date somebody who was not of your religion. It just wasn't allowed.
Yeah, I was raised Catholic, and we weren't allowed to. If I stayed over at my friend Mary Linda's house, I couldn't go to church the next day with her because it wasn't Catholic. I wasn't allowed to go in the Methodist church.
But you were allowed to spend time with her.
Yes.
Yeah, we could do that, but you didn't go to another church.
Yeah. So, yeah,
It's a
definitely
high school,
we were
maybe.
kept.
So do you think that should be a rule? Yes, Mark?
No, if you educate your children enough, then you should be able to trust that, and maybe their influence would rub off on the other.
Mark?
I'm curious about the qualifier in Deuteronomy, and they are discovered. Is it all right if they keep quiet about it?
It's almost like if you're not caught in the act, it didn't happen.
Right, it didn't happen. God
Well,
will forget about it.
if they're not caught in the act, then it's he said, she said. And so that's why they say they have to.
Did they give women that much credibility?
They get no credibility, none, because women were property.
Then it wouldn't be a he said, she said. It would just be a he said.
But they had to.
But
I-
it was clashing cultures with very different rules and everything like that caused that caused the situation that came, because the decisions that were made were completely wrong, but the Israelites were were the chosen people, and if they had been allowed to become part of Shechem culture, then God would have had to choose somebody else for his for his plan for the world.
Well, I think what's a very interesting part of the story is that this whole thing could have changed if they had the opportunity to intermarry Dinah with Shechem, and they could have, instead of using circumcision as a debilitating to, capture all the men and to kill them, if they had used that to say, this is why it's important to us, and this is what we believe, and we want to share our faith with you, it could have gone an entirely different way. But they were so intent on revenge
They were angry.
that they missed the opportunity to share God's love. Roxy.
That's what I was, when you said, what do you think about having your children only associate with Christian faith? Then to whom do they witness? How do they become, how are they going out into the world and making, the gospel known? If they only are around people, thank you. If they only are around people who already are gospel believers. And why do we have missionaries if, because then their children are going to be the only Christian children in a heathen, basically, area. What, how can that be? I mean, I can understand. I wasn't a parent, but I know, even as a teacher, there would be a sweet little girl who was just as precious, and I mean, could have taken her home. And then there were other kids on the playground who would fight and who would argue and who would this and who would that, and it was just like, if I ever saw her approaching those kids, I think, no, don't play with them. Do not play with them, because they will make you one of them. I know that the good is usually taken down by the bad instead of the bad overcoming the good. And so, I mean, I didn't even have a parent's heart. It was just, I just saw the greatness in this kid, and I felt, I don't want her to be affiliated with anything. And yet, how would the other, if the other children have only been fighting and arguing at home, couldn't she, maybe if she became friends with them and invited them over to her house and they saw a family agreeing and parents being kind and
It can make all the difference.
Is that not, a goal for them? But, so, I mean, it's like, oh, it's really good it wasn't here. I mean, I couldn't have taken it. I just could not have taken it.
Bill, you wanted to say something.
Well, when you first started out, she left home to go visit with the women.
Mm-hmm.
Was she gay? Why did she get pregnant? She went to visit with the women.
She went to spend time with her girlfriends. I mean, she was between the age of 13 and 16. So I would guess.
No, that's yours. No, that's yours.
Put it there. Put it there. Thank
Okay,
you.
you're welcome.
So it's all right
So-
then to do that.
So I would be very surprised if she was gay. All right, I'm not going to rule it out.
Bill's going to write a prequel.
But I really think she was just a teenager wanting to spend time with girlfriends.
Was that all right then?
Yes.
So was it all right? In that culture, it actually was not all right.
So we're having such big problems today now.
Because in that culture, the girls were supposed to stay at home and be supervised. And if they should go somewhere, which was very rare, they were chaperoned. That she was allowed to go by both her mother and her father.
But she was the only girl and a princess.
But we don't know that she was the only girl. I really doubt that she was the only girl, but she's the only girl that was mentioned, and it's because of what happened to her and the resulting actions by her brothers.
Maybe she didn't like that at all.
Maybe she didn't like what?
Having what happened, because she wanted to be with the girls.
No. I'm sure she did not like what happened.
No, she didn't.
Because, I mean, this is a young teenage girl who saw all this murder and mayhem. And I don't know how. I know you are. But God's watching you. Just saying.
See,
You get
wound
caught
up.
every time. You have to give her a star.
Yeah, give Jake.
She has friends.
This,
Yeah.
this is, to me, this is a very upsetting story because I just think it's just sad on so many levels. There were so many opportunities by so many people to do the right thing. And time after time after time.
It just snowballed until,
Something so,
But I think it's important to know stories like this from the Bible, to share with our children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, friends. If we don't know these stories, we can't share them. And they're in the Bible for a reason. They're words of caution.
Imagine how differently this would have been had Jacob not decided to buy land in Shechem.
If he had followed God's direction to go and live by his brother Esau, none of this would have happened. None of this.
he would have stepped in as the head of the household. And, corralled his son. Maybe he would have, he should have done it. He might have not been able to because the two had sons and everything, but, he did not take that opportunity.
I think those sons, even if.
Yes, Roxy, one quick last question.
I think that it's not a question, it's a comment. I think it just outlines how we are so capable of doing the wrong thing, how important salvation, the death of Jesus Christ is to all of us, because it's so, all of them did wrong,
Yes.
and all of us do wrong. And I mean, that's a huge, mayhem and murder and all that. That's a really big deal. But we all need forgiveness of whatever it is we did. And it had Jesus not been sent down, I mean, I just can't even imagine.
Okay, thank you. We're going to close with a word of prayer from Ephesians 3. I pray that Christ may live in your hearts by faith. I pray that you will be filled with love. I pray that you will be able to understand how wide and how long and how high and how deep his love is. Amen.